Welcome to the new Quanexus Podcast, where we talk IT. I'm Chuck.
I'm Jack.
And for the first podcast, we're going to start with incident response planning. It's a very deep, in-depth process. And talking about it in this format, I think, is going to be helpful. So you want to start with definitions?
Sure. Before we can really understand incident response planning, a few key definitions are important. First, an event. An event is something that changes a system state. When someone logs into a computer, the system state changed, a log is created, and that's called an event. An incident is an event that actually violates a policy. Then we have precursors and we have indicators. Precursors are things that might identify a threat that's out there that may affect your organization. And an indicator is something that has detected that a threat is inside your organization or maybe going active, which means you have an incident going on.
Great. So the regulation that we follow here at Quanexus is this NIST SP 861 Rev 2. And basically that's just a standard. What is NIST?
NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It was created by the government for a need to start standardizing on processes and controls for organizations to implement.
Great. So the first step in the incident response plan is preparation. And we have two sub-functions of preparation: preparing to handle the incident and prevention of the incident. So starting with preparing to handle the incident, what are some things that we need to do to prepare for the incident?
Great question. In the preparation phase, you should have a contact list of your incident response team members. That should include emergency phone numbers. And on that list, you should also include local law enforcement, as well as possibly the county sheriff if you're in Ohio, as well as the Secret Service organization out of Cincinnati. The Cincinnati field office, Secret Service, is oftentimes able to respond very quickly and assist if there's a financial issue. The FBI, most people think of the FBI as a point of contact, but Secret Service is able to act more quickly than the FBI in many cases. The next item you should have, each member should have a smartphone. That phone's to be left on 24/7. It's a separate phone that when it goes off, you know there's an issue and people are supposed to answer that phone. On top of that, you need to have a defined place. An incident has occurred, you're getting the team together, everybody needs to know where to respond and show up to start working on the incident and execute the plan or update the plan and start executing it. And the fourth item is you need to have a couple of workstations ready to go with the proper software installed to be able to handle the incident.
Okay, great. So you talk about port scanners and packet sniffers, and that may not be something that, depending on the size of your company, you may have access to, but it's okay to work with another company for those more extreme tools.
Right. For example, a lot of our clients do not have highly trained technical people on staff. That's what they hire us for. And we've got those tools in place, and we'll work with our clients, bring those tools in place while part of their incident response plan, meet at the war room, start setting up operations, and we get to work.
Great. So that's preparing to handle the incident. What are we doing just to prevent the incident in the first place?
As part of the preparation, is we're going through and documenting everything and collecting all the information. We're going to see where we have potential weaknesses. So while you would not think prevention is actually part of an incident response plan, everything that's learned by building the incident response plan and going through incident response scenarios should feed back into the protection phase of the organization's controls.
Great. So what are some features that you have found over the years? What do you put in place as part of this preparation phase?
A few key things are definitely needed. The firewall documentation needs to be handy. The operating system configurations, network diagrams, current configuration of network devices, and having the backup to recover should a file server or some critical data be lost. So we'll actually build what's called what we call a crash box. An incident occurred, and we've got these tools in a crash box for each client that will show up when we show up on site, and again, start getting to work to get the incident handled.
I know backups are a whole topic unto themselves, but do we want to talk more? We want to go a little bit deeper on backups?
We'll go a little bit deeper into backups because, again, that's big. There's two types of backups. There's an image-based backup and there's a file-based backup. File-based backups, you are just backing up the files on the system. And if you have to recover a file quickly, you're all set to do that. However, if you have a major system crash and you don't have an image-based backup, you have to rebuild a server, repatch it. Whole lot of effort goes into that. With an image-based backup, what you're actually doing is backing up the computer and the server's DNA. So when you recover from an image-based backup, you bring the system back to a state just like it was before the incident.
Great. And these are all topics that you go into for each client.
Yes.
So when you're building an incident response plan for each client, you're thinking about what backup solution best fits them.
Let's go back to backups for just a moment. An image-based backup will also let you quickly recover files. So it's the best of both worlds. And all our clients are on image-based backup solutions.
Great. All right, so that was the preparation phase. Now we're going to move to prevention.
Great. In prevention, you need to understand what your risks are. Once you understand what the risks are, you're building the incident response plan. But to understand what the risks are, every organization that is in any kind of a regulatory industry needs and is required to perform an annual risk assessment. There are several methodologies. Our methodology is we define what are the critical functions in an organization, and then we look at the assets, the people, and the resources, equipment needed to get those critical functions or keep those critical functions alive. How are we protecting those functions? And then going through the NIST cybersecurity framework. The cybersecurity framework consists of 5 functions. The risk assessment is early in our methodology to do that risk assessment is understand what the critical resources are in the organization, what are the assets, the people, and equipment that are required to support that. And from there, in the 5 functions, the first function is identify, which is the risk assessment. The second function is protect, putting the controls in place to protect the assets that support critical functions. We need to know those controls are working. We need to be able to detect if something's gotten into it. If something's gotten into it, we need to be able to respond to it, which is where we're getting into the incident response plan. And then recovery is the last function. This is where the organization is brought back up to 100% operation.
Great.
A lot to know.
Absolutely. So we're still in prevention. After the risk assessment, we're going to talk about system hardening, network security, and awareness training for the users. So for system hardening, what are we doing there?
System hardening, we don't want every piece of software that's ever been written to be on a system. We only want what is required for that person to do that job on their system. Every piece of software you put on a system makes it vulnerable. So having a standard, having a list of what belongs on that system, and then checking to make sure nothing new's been introduced to that system is very important. Again, there's hundreds of thousands, millions of lines of code and programs, which means there's opportunities for that code to have vulnerabilities, for a threat to take and be able to exploit it.
Or not to be updated, it can sit,
Right. And every piece of software that's not needed just represents a potential vulnerability in the system. So system hardening is only having what's required for that system to do its function.
Great. Network security.
Network security. We talk about protection. which was the second function of the cybersecurity framework. We know what we need to protect. Obviously, networks need to be protected. So firewall, a next generation firewall that includes an antivirus engine, intrusion prevention, DNS filtering. There are known bad sites out there that are listed, preventing people from accidentally going to a known bad site. There are specific categories that can be banned. From a legal perspective, having anybody being able to go anywhere may create an issue for your company. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about network security, is putting things on the wire, things that are monitoring traffic in and out of your network to prevent bad things from happening.
And we talk about sectioning. So if you don't want most of the company to have access to social media, let's say, but you want the marketing team to have access to social media, you can put those in place.
Absolutely. We can create groups that, again, it goes to hardening. The next principle is least privilege. People only need to have access to what they need to perform their job. So if we have a group that needs access to social media, and the majority of the company doesn't, as well as like shopping networks, your purchasing manager probably wants access to Amazon. You may or may not want other users to have access. Good example.
Those are good examples.
We can filter all those things.
And then awareness for users. So.
I can't stress this enough. Awareness training. Awareness training is very important. Your users, your employees can be your company's biggest asset to preventing cyber threats from occurring, or they could be your biggest liability.
Yeah, I mean, most of these breaches that we see in the news start with human error. Start with a person clicking on something, a person being targeted. A lot of times it's not the software that fails. There's a person.
Network security has gotten very, very good. So the new weakness is the person in the organization. It's much easier for me to hack you than to hack through a system. Not to say that's not impossible and people aren't hacking into systems and finding those vulnerabilities, but the human has become the weak link in an organization. Much easier to hack a person.
So when we talk about user awareness training, a really good recent example is this big Twitter hack, right?
Oh, absolutely. Everybody saw this in the news a week ago. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, Barack Obama, Kanye West, all had their Twitter accounts hacked. And it was a 17-year-old. And the way they got into their accounts was they actually hacked. They social engineered an employee. They started out with several employees over at Twitter, and they were able to get and manipulate a Twitter employee. Go ahead.
Right. So they're not guessing Jeff Bezos's password.
No,
they're going about it from inside Twitter.
Not uncommon.
Right.
Someone like Jeff is pretty smart. He's going to have a complex password because he knows the threats that are out there. It's just like someone wanting to hack a network. It's come to the point that hacking networks is very hard. Still goes on a lot. But it is much, much easier to hack an individual and get an individual to do something that they would not normally do, called social engineering. I define social engineering as getting somebody to do something that they would not normally do. It's much easier to hack somebody than to hack a network these days.
Good. Not good, but...
Not good.
Good example. So the next step in the process is detection and analysis, and this is normally how you find out that an incident is occurring or has occurred, right?
Mm-hmm. So what is something, and this is where we talk about indicators of compromise, determining if an incident has occurred. Typically, this occurs in one of a couple fashions. One, a user calls the help desk and says, I'm having this issue, I think something bad has happened, or they'll actually admit to doing something bad, which is always nice to get the truth out of, and they should not fear repercussions. Firewall alerts. Most organizations have firewalls installed. Very few people have them properly set up so they'll actually alert on an indication of compromise on the network. If it detects an intrusion, you need to know that that's an indicator. Next, we have system indicators. Our servers, workstations are all logging data, and we need to look at determine a normal baseline. And if something goes outside that baseline, it may be a good thing because we're doing a lot of work and business is picked up, or it could be an indication that something bad is going on the network. And many times a company finds out they've been hacked by being notified from another company, and typically that company is notifying them and asking them, why are you guys trying to hack our network? Meaning their network's been hacked, and their network's being used to hack into other networks. Or you get a notification from your merchant service, if you take credit cards, that they've identified that you've been breached, and credit cards from that all have a single point in common, you, are being used all over the country to buy things that are not authorized purchases.
Gotcha. So I want to go back to the point before that one. It's possible for your network to be compromised and be used to hack other networks, to hide, so that
very common.
They're hiding behind your network. And so it looks like you're hacking someone.
So exactly. If they can't find anything interesting on your network, they may just decide to hide behind your network. Once they're inside your network, why not? And it's covering their tracks.
And that's another place where system performance alerts could help, because if you're seeing massive amounts of data move around,
all going to another company that you never deal with, that's an indication.
Good.
When we talk about organizations being hacked and being used to hack other organizations, there's a term called a botnet, and there's also zombie computers. Botnets are automated tools that are out there searching for things, and they're like executable little programs. Zombies are computers that have been compromised, that are just sitting on a company's network, doing nothing. The users are performing whatever they need to do. And when there's enough zombies that have been created, an attacker will often wake all the zombies up and then do a denial of service attack, distributed denial of service attack against another company. What a DOS, denial of service attack, is, we're going to generate a ton of traffic against your company to prevent your company from being able to use the internet. A very big one, there's been some very huge distributed denial of service attacks against DNS providers, some of the big worldwide DNS providers. When you type in www.quanexus.com, that has to resolve to an IP address. A DNS server does that. If you can't get to a DNS server, the big DNS servers that many people use, I've just essentially made the internet useless. I've taken down the internet. So when you see some of these outages, they're zombie computers that have been woken up that are now doing a DDoS attack against a DNS provider.
Gotcha. All right, you want to move into planning?
Yep.
So when we're talking about incident response planning is one of those stages. And so this is where we plan for and think ahead about certain attack vectors that are common, that we've seen before, that we see happen all the time. And of course you can't plan for everything, but what are some of the attack vectors that we see and we plan for?
Exactly right. It's an infinite amount of scenarios we can come up with, but there are some common things that we all know are likely to happen if we do experience an incident. Ransomware. Ransomware is huge. Having and knowing what you're going to do in case of a ransomware attack is important. A few considerations is your organization going to pay ransomware, or has a policy that you absolutely will not pay ransom? And if you're not going to pay the ransom, having known good backups, just having a plan. But ransomware's a key one. Systems fail, hardware fails. Has nothing to do with cybersecurity. Again, going back to having a good backup solution and being able to recover, plan on equipment failure. It just happens. Breach Ohio is a breach notification state. The states surrounding Ohio, most of them are breach notification states. Never use the word breach. If you have to use the word breach, contact an attorney and have them handle your media. Contact a privacy attorney that specializes in cyber law. Breaches are bad. And if you suspect you have a breach, use the word, we've had an incident, it's under investigation. But again, using the word breach is a bad thing to do. And loss of equipment, theft of equipment, very important. It's likely that some equipment may be lost, some it may be stolen, whatever reason. You have data on there that's now out of your control. An easy way to prevent that is if your systems are encrypted, that is not considered a loss of data. So it's a non-reportable event, i.e. you don't have to use the word breach. Loss of internet and email. Big. Companies have become so dependent on the internet and email, having a backup solution for business continuity and being able to have a secondary way to get your users their email is very important. You can plan on it. And in light of today's current situation, planning for a pandemic. We had a lot of clients call panicking about not being able to go to the office when we went into shutdown. So we scrambled and set up a lot of work from home technology to assist our clients with it being able to continue their operation. But some forethought into that is important. Go ahead.
Right, and planning out these scenarios. And I think it's interesting how a lot of these pieces connect, right? So the ransomware also has to do with the backup solution. So you have to think about if you get ransomware and you lose the local server, do you have a cloud backup that you can go to that was not encrypted?
Oh, that's a great point.
Right. And
actually, let me expand on that.
Sure.
Just a minute. Ransomware. Some of the new variants of ransomware now actually generate multiple backups, which means that if you only have a couple backups and the backups are happening to the same device and not being stored remotely, that they can't be overwritten, the criminals will infect the system, and once the system is infected with the keys, they will run multiple backups, so your backups will now be useless.
Gotcha.
So you need to have an isolated backup to protect from ransomware.
How do we plan for hardware failures?
Several ways. Depending, again, when you get through the risk assessment, you need to determine what's critical. And whatever is critical is where you put your resources to back up and protect the critical functions.
Right,
so
because we know that we're going to lose hardware over time.
Right, and it depends. If that hardware, not all hardware is necessary to support some critical functions, but the hardware that is necessary to support critical functions, you need to, we have clients that buy cold spares. A cold spare is, this server is important, we can't be without this equipment, we can't wait 48 hours to get this equipment back up and running. So they'll actually buy a spare server, have it sitting at a remote location. So if something happens to the equipment on site, we've got another piece of equipment we could quickly bring in, do a recovery to that piece of equipment from the latest backup, and they're up and running. So instead of days of downtime, but again, what you have to do is determine what's critical and how much pain does the organization suffer without that asset. And then once you understand that, then you can appropriate the proper resources to protect and back up against a failure.
Yeah, and this conversation reminds me or gets me thinking about the Garmin attack that just happened. So Garmin was ransomware and they had to shut down everything. They had to shut down phone support, they had to shut down email support. So they got attacked and their response to that was shut everything off. So they had no way to communicate with their customers.
And that is a typical response, but doing a proper business risk assessment the business impact assessment, understanding these are the threats, and then you've got the threats, you've got likelihood that an event can happen that's going to generate an incident. And based on studying that information, you place your resources. So if they thought this event, if the likelihood was very, very low that this would ever happen, it happened, that they bought the risk. And when we talk about risk assessments, it is okay for an organization to accept a risk as long as they can articulate and explain why they accepted the risk. If you can't explain why you accepted the risk, then you're negligent. If you can explain, you are defensible. So these become legal issues. If part of their risk assessment included the expense to do this versus the likelihood of us actually having this incident, it was justified and the board approved it, then it comes down to was the board negligent or not, and chances are the board wasn't negligent as long as it was discussed and that was their decision, they'll be defensible.
Okay.
Not to mention there's a ton of reputation damage done here,
Yeah.
but that's another topic.
That's kind of the real issue, right? So once we learn that we have an incident, that we have an issue, which we learned about through the help desk or through a user, the next step is to contain it, get rid of it, and recover from it. Mm-hmm. Let's talk more about that phase.
So the third function of the incident response plan framework, the NIST framework is what I'm referring to that we talked about before, is contain, eradicate, and recover. Those three items are covered, and those are the three sub-functions. Contain it. We have an incident, be it ransomware, be it an infected computer. What we need to do is isolate that system and prevent that system from affecting other systems. There's a term called a logic bomb. You need to have a plan and know what you want to do and what's really important to the organization, because if you unplug a computer, the fact that that computer is no longer on the network, or the fact that the bad guys can't see that and may be in other computers on your network, may actually do more damage. So just disconnecting the network jack, unplugging it, can actually trigger other events, that are actually incidents that will do more damage to the organization. That needs to be taken into consideration. Evidence, forensic evidence. If you turn the system off, you may be also deleting evidence that may be needed. So we need to isolate that system based on what the company's priorities are. That should be part of the plan. The next, we need to clean whatever is affecting the computer and get it off it. That's called the eradication subfunction. And once that's done, we need to get that system put back together and get it to the state where it's operating the way it should be, which is the recovery function. And as part of the recovery function, there should be one final check to make sure that there are no remnants left of whatever created the incident.
Okay, good. And we're talking about a system, but that could be a server, that could be a set of servers, that could be an entire...
It could be or it could be a single workstation.
Right.
If it hasn't spread too far.
Okay. The next step in the process is the post-incident, and this is where we learn about what went wrong, figure out what could have been done differently, feedback loop back into our plan. So what are the steps that we go through in this post-incident?
Again, this is to learn from what just happened, and this is where we talk about incident response feeding into prevention. We need to document exactly what happened with all the details, what time, where, who was affected, the scope of what went wrong. We need to document what went well, how did the staff perform, how were things documented, were the procedures followed. From there, we can determine what needs to be updated. So lessons learned, update the documentation, and lessons learned feed back into the prevention and detection mechanisms so we can stop these things from occurring again. And as the final part, were there any precursors or indicators that could have been used to earlier or more quickly identify that an incident is occurring?
Gotcha. So were there warning signs that went unheard?
Right.
So that's interesting that we want to document not only what went wrong, but what went right.
Mm-hmm.
So what followed the plan, but then also where did it break down?
Exactly.
Good.
If you're in a regulated industry, well, depending on what industry you're in, a lot of our clients have regular audits based on the industry they're in.
Sure.
Banking, medical. They're required to have incident response plans. They're also required to document their incidents, and this is all supporting the others that are looking for these documents. It's one thing to have a policy. Every organization, not every, a lot of organizations have policies, but then you have controls and feedback loops. And these are the things that actually show that you do what you say you do. The policies aren't just a pile of paper that get dusted off once a year and updated.
Right.
So by having everything documented shows that you are doing what you say you do. And when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to security, it's all about constant improvement.
Right. Yeah, it's a nonstop.
It's not just checking boxes. It's about improvement.
Good.
And getting better.
So we've given a couple examples throughout this talk, but do you have an example of how these steps work?
Let's take ransomware. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on ransomware, but just as a quick kickoff. Typically, ransomware is found, a user calls the help desk, they can't get to a file. They don't know why they can't get to it, but it just won't open, and it's because it's been encrypted. So, user calls help desk. Help desk quickly needs to analyze what is going on. Okay, we've been hit with ransomware. Who's affected? How are we going to isolate the affected machines? What's going to be the process to recover the systems? Do we need to collect forensic evidence, which means go through a chain of custody command when we generate the evidence and protect the evidence? For many organizations that we deal with, understanding what went on is very important to them, and forensic evidence is really for prosecution. It's very difficult to prosecute these things unless there's fraud involved. Most of my clients aren't concerned about the prosecution phase. They're more concerned about, let's not worry about forensic evidence. I need to get my organization back up and running.
Right.
So that needs to be determined, but based on that, spend more time here, less time there. We go in, once it's isolated, we eradicate, we make sure it's clean, and then we put it back online, which is the last phase, and not the last phase, but the third function, and the fourth function is lessons learned.
Great. All right, to sum everything up, we've been talking about incident response planning today and all of the steps that go through building an incident response plan, and just a peek into what that looks like and what Quanexus does for other companies when developing these incident response plans for each individual company. Again, we follow the NIST protocol, the SP800 61 Rev 2. That's the standard that we follow here at Quanexus.
The reason we use a standard like NIST is because it goes through everything. If we came up with our own standard, we might miss something. So having an organization, and there are several organizations out there that do this. ISO is a huge organization. We chose NIST, they're all good. It is so we have a checklist. In the 861 Rev 2 document, which I encourage you to download if you want to try to do this on your own.
Right, this is a public document, right?
Yeah, it's free to download. There's an actual checklist to go through to build an incident response plan. Also, another very, very useful site is sans.org, sans.org. And over there, when we talked about the common attack vectors, such as ransomware, hard drive failure or equipment failure, loss of internet, pandemics. There's an example playbook. So as part of your incident response planning, you should develop playbooks to handle these common vectors. And there's an example playbook at the SANS.org website that you can download. Again, it's free, and we use that as a prototype to build our playbooks to handle the common threats that our clients may see. We've been doing security for a long time. We've been working with clients in the regulated industries, and a big part of our business at Quanexus is helping our clients be compliant and safe.
Absolutely. If the incident response plan is something that you think your company might need to go through or is lacking, the first step in this process before really building an incident response plan is a risk assessment. Talk more about a risk assessment.
So incident response falls, something's gone wrong. The risk assessment is the starting point for pretty much everything. In the risk assessment, starting at the top, you're defining what's critical to the organization. And without understanding what's critical to the organization, you don't know how to invest the organization's resources. And going back to the cybersecurity framework, we have identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. First thing is identify. Identify critical resources. Then you need to identify what's required to keep those critical resources online that drive the business. These critical resources or the critical functions are functions internal that run the business, as well as external that provide goods and services to your clients. Then once we have that defined and the resources that support it, which are people, processes, and technology, then we can put protection mechanisms in place. Protection mechanisms are, we spend appropriate resources based on risk assessment to keep the resources that back up the critical functions. Then we need to know that those protections are working. That's the detect phase. We need to verify and have a feedback loop saying that the protections are doing what they're supposed to do and haven't fallen short. If something falls through the detect phase, we're now at the fifth function of the cybersecurity, or the fourth function of the cybersecurity framework, which is responding. We've detected that something has gone wrong at function 3, and function 4, we respond, and the response is the incident response plan. So the incident response plan really comes down later in the overall IT security program.
Today we've been talking about incident response planning. We hope that you enjoy this new podcast format. Hopefully it'll be an easier way for you to understand these concepts that Quanexus provides to their clients. If you enjoyed the content, please like, comment, subscribe, and there'll be more to come.
Right. And if you'd like to learn more about how Quanexus can help your organization implement an IT security program, please check out our website. Give us a call. I'd be happy to meet with you for a free, no obligation consultation.